Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. On today's episode, we'll look at how choristers learned music in times past. Our guest for today is Charles Weaver. Charlie is on the faculty at the Juilliard School, where he teaches performance practice on plucked instruments. He has performed with Quicksilver, Piffaro, the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, the Folger Consort, Apollo's Fire, Blue Heron, Musica Pacifica, the New York Continuo Collective, and Tenet. He is the Associate Director of Music at the Church of St. Mary in Norwalk, Connecticut, where he has worked in the past with the student Schola program, and where he continues to sing and do some directing with the St. Mary Schola Cantorum, specializing in Renaissance polyphony and Gregorian chant. He is also known for his careful and excellent preparation of performing editions from original scores.
Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, happy to join you.
So you're a specialist in plucked instruments like theorbo and lute, and you play in a number of really top-notch early music ensembles, and you sing and direct an extensive repertoire of medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque choral repertoire. Before we discuss how your study of this quote-unquote early music might be of use to Catholic music directors and Catholic music teachers, especially those working with children, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what draws you to these early repertoires, Renaissance music, medieval music, Gregorian chant. What do you find so compelling, for example, about singing a Gregorian introit or entrance antiphon? What are some of the sounds and ideas that you savor most in works by famous Renaissance composers like Lassus or Fairfax?
I think chant really doesn't need much of a defense. I think it's instantly compelling to people because they sense that it's a timeless sort of music. It doesn't have any baggage that most other music has, and that it feels like it's eternal. It feels very spiritual, even to someone who's not a Christian or Catholic. And as far as early music, I think Renaissance music in particular draws me because I feel like more than any other type of music, it uses harmony in a way that draws the listener in. There's a use of consonance and dissonance. The dissonance, as you may know, is very very tightly controlled, and it's used in specific ways to enhance the feeling of the harmony. And it's just, in general, Renaissance music is more consonant on the whole than much later music. So there's just a sort of elegant beauty to it that speaks to me in particular.
You've worked as a choral musician for quite a long time, and so has your wife. Your wife is an excellent soprano, and I know that this work as a choral musician played a role in your conversion to the Catholic faith. Could you tell us a little bit about your story? Sure.
So I'm actually more of a revert than a convert. So I grew up Catholic, but in a very typical sort of suburban American parish in the 80s and 90s. So I never encountered beautiful liturgy or music as a child. So I never really completely fell away from the church, but there was a time when I met my wife, actually. She was singing at a high church, Episcopalian church in New York City, St. Mary the Virgin, near Times Square. And it was in going to church there that I first encountered chant being used in a liturgical setting, and I first encountered beautiful Renaissance polyphony being used in a liturgical setting. And so, in a way, chant almost attracted me to leave the Catholic Church, but I ended up getting hired to sing in a choir at St. Agnes in New York, and that's when I realized that all the things that I found appealing in high church Anglican worship were actually Catholic initially, and it was actually in the process of singing the propers every week, singing liturgical music, that I really developed a much deeper and richer connection to my Catholic faith. I never really seriously left the church. I had just been sort of indifferent and, was sort of moving away from it because I wasn't seeing the beauty that instantly spoke to me when I encountered it in other places.
So would you say that, in a sense, experiencing chant in this high Anglican setting versus the Catholic setting helped you to pray better? Was it something that deepened your prayer life, especially when you encountered it in the Catholic setting where you could receive the Eucharist and were at home in the church?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, it's the Anglican version of these things, the sort of prayers written by Cranmer, and it's all extremely beautiful, as many people know who've encountered it either within a high church Anglican setting or within the Catholic Church in the ordinariate Mass. It's very compelling, but everything, as it turns out, everything I liked about it, or everything that spoke to me, or everything that drew me closer to my faith about it, was actually Catholic in origin. And it seems providential now that I ended up being hired to do something that was so vocational in a way. It came at a very good time for me in my life that I got asked to join a choir singing for the Latin Mass, because I'm not sure it's not something I would have encountered on my own. And I'm glad I did find it.
So switching gears a little bit, I want to tap into the intense amount of research and study you've done in early music and talk about its interaction with music education and the wisdom we can take away from the church's history of teaching. So many English-speaking church musicians, if they work with children, often associate excellence in choral education for children with the Anglicans. And it's true that there, as you know, and you were just talking about, there are really many musically excellent programs for children and adults in Anglican or Episcopalian cathedrals, chapels, parishes. Of course, we know, however, that this field wasn't always dominated by the Anglicans. The Catholic Church was long the principal and often only institution educating people in the West, and was for many centuries the main source of music education and artistic patronage. Why has the Church always seen the musical education of children as vital for her liturgical life and for the care of her sons and daughters and leading them to Christ and to heaven?
Sure. Well, as you know, music is one of the 7 liberal arts. So in the classical conception of education as practiced by the Catholic Church throughout its history, music was a vital part of that education. And part of the reason for that is that in the classical conception, music is the study of harmony in the sense that harmony is a rational connection between things, right? This tradition goes back to Pythagoras, or at least to the Pythagoreans, that music expresses a certain harmonic relationship, especially between numbers, that is a way it actually governs not only the kind of music that we listen to, but also governs the way our bodies work. So there's instrumental music, but there's also human music, which is, in the medieval or classical conception, how the various humors in our body interact and are governed by their proportions to each other. And also cosmic music, in that in the classical conception, the entire universe is governed by this order and proportionality, which is an aspect of musical study in the medieval or classical way of thinking. So the Church has always incorporated that into its understanding because it is incorporating the classical tradition going back to the ancient Greeks. One example that I think is really striking is if you look at the life of St. Ignatius of Loyola, he describes this important moment in his conversion when he realized that God is both 1 and 3, and that he's like, I think what he's talking about in this particular metaphor is that he's like one chord being formed from 3 notes, which are each separate, but they also form a triad, and that that the triad is a union in that it's one thing that we hear. We hear the harmony of the triad as a unity, but it's also a trinity in the sense that there are these 3 notes, but each of the notes exists in its entirety by itself, but also exists in this unity of the chord in a way. So that there's this musical theological connection that's very profound.
That's really interesting. I'd actually never heard that story about St. Ignatius. So you've spent a lot of time studying how musicians of the past, including children, learned music. And you've been able to incorporate a lot of these pedagogical techniques into your work with both adults and children. What are some of the most interesting ways you've discovered in your study about how children were taught to read music? And we'd be really interested, I know I would, and listeners would be too, to hear how you've incorporated these techniques into your own rehearsals.
Sure. So if you think of music education as the things I was speaking about previously, the sort of esoteric, human, cosmic connections, that's all grouped under the idea of music theory in the older conception. But then there's also practical music. And what I've come to understand about the way that was taught during the sort of golden age of church music, which I guess would run from, say, the beginnings of Gregorian chant until the Renaissance, they viewed just the very process of learning to read music and learning to understand the complex way in which polyphony in particular was notated, that was in itself an education about how to compose or how to understand music. So the idea is that just by learning to read your part, you were gaining a very implicit theoretical education about how music works. So briefly, in the Renaissance, the way choral music was laid out was that you only were looking at your line, and there are no bar lines, and you're reading your part, and everyone is doing this at the same time and reading their own parts, and it sort of forms this polyphonic thing together out of the whole. So what I've done with the time I spent with our program in Norwalk with the student Schola is to actually have them sing from the original notation for polyphonic music. Much of it is quite readable if you read music now. It's just a matter of getting used to looking at only your part, not seeing the parts around you, and not having bar lines to sort of help anchor you in the metrical structure. And I've had the luxury of a lot of time to spend on this because the students would only sing every few months or so. So you're given quite a long amount of time to prepare a piece. So you can really spend a lot of that time learning to actually read the older notation. And in the course of that, you are developing a sense of how counterpoint works and how musical ideas are expressed in terms of rhythmic organization and melodic construction. So in other words, it's sort of hands-on theory in that it's very practical, but it also, over the course of learning it, creates a sense of understanding in an implicit way.
Do you find that your students listen differently when they're reading just from their own part than if you would hand out a score with all the parts together?
Absolutely, because I think you're taking away something that choral musicians tend to use as a crutch. I'm not saying that it's always wrong to read from score. It's expedient. It's certainly easier if you get lost. It's easier to get back on if you're reading from the score. But, we should not forget that the sort of part book culture, this idea that you're only looking at your own part, is actually still something that's practiced in chamber music and orchestras for instrumentalists now. If you go to see a concert with a symphony, they're all just looking at their own parts, and yet they manage to sort of stay together with the whole ensemble. But I do think that there's a value in learning to read that way as a singer. You learn to listen differently because you're not using your listening just to get your own note. You're not saying, oh, there's my note in the tenor part 5 measures before, so I can get my note from there. You have to sort of listen to the entirety of the ensemble, and I think there is a value there musically.
Yeah. So One of the things I found really effective in teaching chant to my children's choir is having the children all read from one super enlarged score at the front of the class, essentially like a modern choir book. There's a website I use called blockposters.com, and I'll take a chant excerpt and export it as a JPEG, an image file. And then I can upload it to this website, and it sends me a multi-page PDF. And then I kind of use my scissors and tape and paste it all together. And I get a score essentially that's several feet wide and several feet tall. And when we all sing from the same score, I can help the children better understand the notation, pointing at it as we sing and discussing the different neumes. It also helps, I think, with concentration, especially for the younger children, encouraging them to pay attention because they know exactly where they are in the music. You know, sometimes when they have their own scores, their eyes wander and they sing more from memory than from precise reading. And I've also found that looking at the same score helps them to listen to each other better in some of the ways that you were talking about with just reading from their own individual part. While there were many reasons in the past for creating these large edition choir books, including, you know, the fact that books were just really expensive to create, what role did choir books play in teaching people to read music?
It's a great question. You are right that books were very expensive. So there is sort of this practical side to why you might want just one giant book for your whole choir. But there is also a psychological benefit of sharing music. I mean, I think most people, have had the experience of sharing a piece of music with someone and trying to sing it together. And you realize there's a certain psychological connection there from reading the same book or sharing that is hard to capture if everyone has their own score. So it's just an extension of that idea towards the whole choir. Most choir directors, I think, know that one difficulty you face in an ensemble is getting people to look up out of their scores and look at you as a conductor. But if we're all just sharing the same score, then you know everyone's eyes are in the same place. And even if there's maybe a little less focus on the director in terms of trying to wave your hands or something, it's easy to see the director out of the corner of your eye. But everyone being focused on the same exact spot at any given time, I think has a value because it instantly increases the ensemble. In my experience, a lot of ensemble problems in chanting instantly get better if everyone is exactly looking at the same spot because you're sharing a focus, you're sharing a point of reference. And I think there's also, just sort of another practical element of it is that it sort of forces you to stand closer to your neighbor. And, that's another thing that choir directors often encounter, that people are just sort of spread out too naturally. But if you look at paintings of choirs, singing in the middle of the Renaissance, they're often bunched very closely together. And in fact, I think you can just communicate sort of rhythmic information to each other much more readily if you're just standing close and reading from the same score.
Yeah, that's a great point. I remember the first time I used that kind of choir book with my children's choir, they all started just lurching forward towards the front of the classroom. And I actually had to tell them to back up because they were all so interested and huddled around the board that I was squished and I didn't have any room to move.
Right.
Yeah. So this is changing gears a little bit from reading to understanding rhythm. In Renaissance polyphony, rhythm is such a huge element for singing well. When a listener listens to it, it might feel kind of serene and peaceful, but the experience of singing Renaissance polyphony is a really intensely rhythmical one. And so obviously there had to have been techniques for teaching that effectively, especially to children. So in your study, what are some of the most effective historical techniques you've come across for teaching rhythm or pulse or phrasing?
Right. In the Renaissance, the idea is called tactus, right? That there is this sort of governing motion of time or tempo that sort of unvaryingly communicates rhythmic organization during the course of singing a piece. One of the ideas in doing early music or doing historically informed performance is that you're trying to recapture some of the mindset of an earlier age. in respect to the way rhythm works, you almost have to get back into an Aristotelian sense of how time works. Time is the study of motion. That time and change are linked in an intimate way to motion, and there's not this sort of Newtonian understanding of absolute time and space. So in the way they write about it, they talk about the tactus as being a physical motion of the hand up and down. You can see this, going back to Renaissance paintings. Anytime you see people singing, at least one person is waving a hand, and what they are doing is communicating this sort of incessant down-up tactus motion. It's a little simpler than more modern conducting or beat patterns, because it's really just, it has two parts, down and up. And triple meter is done with the same down and up. It's just that the down lasts twice as long as the up. But you can still see this kind of conducting if you've ever watched an ensemble singing shape note music. Essentially, everyone in the room is waving their arms down and up with the pulse of the music. And so what I've done with some of my students, especially when I was working with the children's Schola, is to, when they're singing from their own part without bar lines, I have everyone do the down up thing with their hands, and they feel kind of silly at first, but it physically incorporates the pulse in a bodily way, which you just can't get without that. Nowadays, we tend to discourage people tapping their foot or whatever because it's often distracting to the neighbors. But if sort of everyone is doing this tactus thing, you almost don't need the bar lines, because there's the rhythmic organization, the metrical organization is happening in a bodily way within the choir itself, rather than simply on the page or watching one person conduct. So there's this profound way in which, like, your physical presence is integrated with the rhythmic organization of the music. So I would encourage anyone to try this with a choir if you're singing Renaissance polyphony, is to just basically have everyone do a down and an up in each bar and sort of internalize that feel and the way that the melodic and rhythmic lines move around that, because that's really sort of integral to the way the music is put together.
Yeah. So in another vein, I understand that you've also taught children the skill of putting texts into Renaissance polyphony. For example, you hand them their part from a Josquin motet, and it might have the first grammatical phrase of the text at the beginning of the line, but the individual syllables of the text aren't assigned to specific notes. The singer has to know the rules of Latin accentuation and see how to fit the text to the music. And this might seem like a complex thing even to a trained singer in the modern times. So how have you taught students how to do this? And what have you seen in their growth as musicians as a result of taking the time to do this? Surely it would just be easier to just hand them a score which has all the right words in the right places.
Right. I mean, this goes back to the idea I think I was speaking about before, about having the luxury of a long time to prepare something. I mean, if you need your choir to sing at a mass in an hour and you're handing the music for the first time, certainly it makes plenty of sense to give them a well-edited score with very clear text underlay. But if you have the luxury of time to prepare, there is an element, again, in getting this, sort of getting the feel of the music internalized. If you hand people the original notation and then they feel maybe a little more personally invested in, putting their own thought into turning this esoteric piece of notation into something that they're actually singing. One thing you raised in your question was, the complexity of this, especially for children. And what I've found is that children are much more ready to take on something like that than an adult singer, because they basically, it's sort of all new. I think you've probably had this experience with handing neumes to children. They, to them, it's just another thing that they're going to learn. And it's often the case that if you hand square neumes to an adult choir that's never sung from them before. It's a big deal. We can't read this. It doesn't have enough lines on the stave and so forth. But I think for kids, it's like 4-line stave, 5-line stave, doesn't really matter. Whether the words are under the notes or whether the words are sort of packed at the beginning and written in this funny Renaissance script, either way, they are pretty game to learn from it. It's just that it does indeed increase the amount of time you have to spend in preparation because, obviously you can't throw something like that together. You really have to do it over and over again and think about how that's going to work. It's sort of adding a level of complexity to the reading process, but I think that has a value in terms of internalizing the way you're going to sing it.
Yeah. So to kind of wrap up, what are some of the key elements we can take away from the church's wisdom and experience of teaching music when building an excellent choral program for children in our current times? And obviously, this question is something that we can talk about from a technical standpoint, as we have been, but it also, beyond this musical excellence that we all strive for, what can we learn from the past in fostering in children a love of both the life of Christian virtue and the Catholic faith when we look back at how the church has historically educated children?
That's such a big question, but, to sort of go back to my personal experience, I wish I had, as a child, been exposed to these ideas, because the church is the heir to the sort of classical understanding of music and its connection to heavenly things and earthly things. I mean, the idea that nature is put together in an ordered way is a profound one and a profound part of at least my understanding of the Catholic faith. So I think incorporating the sort of traditional music of the church into the liturgical life of a parish, it does, offer virtue, even if it's not explicitly teaching that. I like to think of Hildegard of von Bingen's liturgical drama Ordo Virtutum, which is basically a long piece of chant in which the soul encounters various virtues which helps the soul to overcome the devil and reach communion with God. The profound aspect of that I think is really interesting is that all of the virtues sing, but the devil speaks. The devil does not get a singing role in the drama because music is of a divine origin. I mean, it's this miraculous thing that we are able to sing with our voices and create these harmonies and connections with other voices that really do, I think it's sort of self-evidently of divine origin, and that harmony is just this beautiful thing that is ineffable and mysterious and sort of universally moving, I think.
That's really wonderful, and so helpful in terms of thinking about a fundamentally Catholic conception of what education is, that it's not just the conveyance of information, but rather incorporating you into a world which makes sense and which leads you to communion with God. Thanks so much for these thoughts today, Charlie. This is really interesting and helpful, both to me and I think to our listeners too. And so I'm really grateful that you were able to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. We here at Square Notes look forward to similar episodes in the future, exploring historical pedagogical techniques that can bear good fruits when applied in modern choral programs. In the meantime, listeners of this episode might be particularly interested in a course I'm offering this summer at St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers, New York, called Teaching Gregorian Chant to Children. It runs from July 22nd to 26th, 2019. The course will cover some of the techniques discussed today, as well as others from historical practice. The class will focus, however, on guiding teachers to use the Ward method of music instruction. The Ward method is a comprehensive music education method developed by Catholic convert Justine Ward in the 1920s and used extensively in Catholic schools until the 1970s. The method has as its goals the education of the child in the beauty of the Church's sacred music and helping children participate well in the sacred liturgy through the singing of Gregorian chant. The method incorporates ear training so that children are able to both intelligently hear and sing written music at sight, as well as a thorough grounding in musical notation which lends itself to other musical studies. Each student learns to match pitch and sing with good vocal technique. Games which develop composition and improvisation skills are incorporated into each lesson, and students are trained in rhythmic and melodic dictation. The method is designed so that each activity takes 2 to 5 minutes and keeps young children engaged. More information can be found at our website, sacredmusicpodcast.com. Join us next time for an episode on the role of sacred art in evangelization and church patronage of art, with our guest, Dr. Elizabeth Lev.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.